The device you are listening to right now, whether it's a smartphone in your pocket or, a tablet on your desk.
Or even the battery sitting in the electric vehicle in your driveway.
Exactly. That device is almost certainly powered by minerals pulled directly from the earth of the Democratic Republic of Congo.
Which is just a massive reality to wrap your head around.
It really is. I mean, we are talking about a nation sitting on what is widely estimated to be trillions of dollars of untapped raw elemental wealth.
Trillions, with a T.
Right. It is basically the geographic beating heart of the modern global economy. So, logically, when you look at the socioeconomic data of a country that rich, you expect to see gleaming skylines, world-class universities, right?
You'd expect a rapidly expanding middle class, yeah.
But what if I told you that looking at the actual data, and we have a massive stack of data here spanning from the 1960s to the 2020s, reveals something entirely different?
Something much darker.
Yeah. What if, instead of widespread prosperity, we find over 5 million children locked entirely out of basic schooling?
It's staggering.
Or a society where the vast majority of the population is trapped in the seemingly endless cycle of extreme poverty and volatile economic whiplash. Welcome to today's deep dive. We are opening the black box of one of the most profound paradoxes of the modern world.
And we really are looking at a paradox here.
We are. Today, we are exploring the socio-economic trajectory of the DRC and trying to answer one fundamental question. How can a country with so much wealth have so much struggle?
And why this matters to you, the listener, is because this isn't just, a localized history lesson. This is really a masterclass in the absolute limits of resource wealth.
Yeah, it challenges everything we assume.
Exactly. The data we are exploring today challenges our most basic intuitive assumptions about how the world works. We tend to believe that rich land automatically equals rich citizens.
Right, like it's a direct translation.
But this data proves, mathematically and tragically, that raw earth means absolutely nothing without the right structural mechanisms in place. You have to be able to convert those minerals into human capital.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to really understand the sheer scale of the disconnect between wealth and well-being, we have to start at the absolute foundation.
The macroeconomy.
Yes, the macroeconomy. Think of this deep dive like an architectural stress test. We have the foundation, the load, the materials, and the structural integrity. And looking at this first slide in the data, the foundation, the economic growth over the last few decades, it doesn't look like a developing nation steadily finding its footing.
No, it looks like a seismograph during a catastrophic earthquake.
That is exactly what it looks like. We're looking at a two-dimensional line chart here of the annual per capita GDP growth rate, and the swings are incredibly violent.
You can clearly see the periods where the economy just completely craters.
Right. The data highlights these negative growth zones with red dashed lines. It plunges into severe negative double digits. At one point, it hits a shocking negative 13.1% contraction.
Which is just a massive collapse.
And then, a few years later, it might sputter back up to a barely positive 1% growth, only to drop again.
What's fascinating here is the psychological and logistical reality of living and governing inside that kind of economic chaos. We have to translate that number into human experience.
Yeah, what does the 13.1% contraction actually look like on the ground?
Well, to give you some context, think about the Great Recession of 2008 in the U.S. and Europe. Millions of people lost their homes. Unemployment skyrocketed.
Oh, it was devastating. Entire industries had to be bailed out.
Exactly. And that was triggered by an economic contraction of roughly 4 or 5% in advanced economies with massive safety nets.
Wow. Only 4 or 5%.
Yeah. Now imagine a contraction nearly 3 times that severe. Imagine it happening in an environment that already has virtually no social safety net. No unemployment insurance, no food stamp programs.
Wait, I have to push back on this a little, or at least ask for some clarification. I mean, I understand that a 13% drop is devastating, but why is it swinging so wildly in the first place?
That's the core question, isn't it?
Yeah, because if they are sitting on all these minerals, shouldn't that provide a stable baseline of income? Like, people always need copper and cobalt.
That is the exact trap of a resource-dependent economy. It's what economists often refer to as being tethered to the global commodity cycle.
Tethered to the cycle.
Yeah. When your entire national income is based on exporting unrefined raw materials, your economy isn't determined by the steady, predictable productivity of your citizens.
It's determined by the spot price of copper on the London Metal Exchange.
Exactly. If global demand surges, your GDP spikes. But if there's a global downturn or a new technology temporarily reduces the demand for a specific mineral, the price collapses overnight.
And you have nothing else to fall back on.
Right, you have no diversified industries, no major manufacturing base, no tech sector, no robust services sector to absorb the shock.
So you are entirely at the mercy of forces thousands of miles away.
Precisely. And that extreme volatility destroys the most crucial element of development, which is predictability. True development requires long-term planning.
You can't plan if you don't know what you'll have next year.
Put yourself in the shoes of a local official or a finance minister. You want to build a 10-year national power grid expansion,
Yeah.
right?
Sure.
Or project how many teacher training colleges you need to build over the next decade. To do that, you need to know roughly what your tax revenues will look like 5 years from now.
But if your economy is violently swinging from negative 13% to positive 1% to negative 5%,
You simply cannot plan. You are permanently stuck in crisis management mode.
and that's just at the state level. When we zoom in on the micro level, that volatility destroys a family's ability to plan a household budget.
Absolutely.
I mean, a farmer can't decide if they should take out a microloan to buy better seeds because they have no idea if the local economy will completely collapse by harvest time.
Right. Or a parent doesn't know if they will have the income to keep their child in school next month.
Which leads us directly into the second major force acting on this country, that load we talked about. While the economic foundation is violently shaking, the demographic weight pressing down on it is growing exponentially.
The demographic data is incredibly stark.
It really is. When you look at the stacked area chart in our source data, there is a statistic that absolutely stops you in your tracks. Over this multi-decade timeline, the youth dependency ratio climbs and holds at an astronomical high.
It peaks at what, 90.7%?
Yes, 90.7%. The data actually highlights that peak with a big blue circle. It's just a massive number.
We need to define exactly what that metric means because it is the hidden engine of so much of this story.
Yeah, break that down for us.
The dependency ratio measures the number of dependents, which typically means children under the age of 15, plus elderly adults over 64 compared to the working age population, which is those between 15 and 64.
I want you, the listener, to really visualize this in practical terms. Imagine a room of 100 people representing the entire country. In this room, only about 47 or 48 people are of working age. Those 47 people are carrying the absolute total burden of feeding, clothing, housing, and educating the other 52 or 53 people who are almost entirely young children.
It's a massive burden.
Nearly half the society is entirely dependent on the physical labor and income of the other half just to survive another day.
If we unpack the economics of this, it is devastating for national growth. In development economics, we talk a lot about the demographic dividend.
The demographic dividend.
Right. That's the magical window in a country's history where birth rates start to drop, and suddenly you have a massive boom in working-age adults, but relatively few dependent children to care for.
Oh, like what happened with the Asian tigers.
Exactly. That is what drove the massive historical economic hypergrowth of places like South Korea, Taiwan, and Singapore in the late 20th century. They had maximum producers and minimum consumers.
So they could save and invest.
Right. They could take all that extra income and invest it into universities, high-tech infrastructure, and savings accounts.
Yeah.
But what the data shows in the DRC is the exact opposite.
It's not a dividend.
No, it is a demographic bomb.
But wait, let me play devil's advocate here for a second. Aren't children eventually going to grow up and become workers? Isn't a massive youth population technically a future dividend? Why is it inherently a bomb?
That's a great question. It is only a future dividend if you have the surplus capital right now to invest in them.
Ah, I see.
At a 90% dependency ratio, every single dollar earned by a working adult is immediately consumed by basic survival needs. You earn a day's wage, and it immediately goes to buying food, a roof, and basic clothing for the 4 or 5 dependents in your household.
There is zero surplus left over.
Exactly. It's an issue of capital accumulation.
Yeah.
Without a surplus, families cannot save money. Without family savings, local banks have no capital deposits to lend out.
And without lending, small businesses can't get loans to buy tractors or build factories.
Right. And at the national level, the state has no surplus tax revenue to invest in major infrastructure or wealth-building projects. Every single resource is immediately cannibalized by the urgent daily need to keep a massive booming youth population alive.
So the children will eventually grow up, yes, but because there was no money to educate them or build industries for them to work in.
They simply grow up to become unskilled laborers in a stagnant economy, And the cycle repeats.
It's like being on a treadmill that someone keeps turning up to a full sprint. You are putting in a massive amount of physical work. You're exhausting yourself every single day, but the sheer volume of dependence acts like gravity.
And that is a very accurate analogy.
It keeps you locked in the exact same place. You can't actually move forward. You are just fighting desperately not to be thrown off the back of the machine.
And it naturally raises the question, what actually happens to those millions of dependents when the system cannot mathematically support them?
Which brings us to the human capital crisis outlined in the data.
The materials in your structural analogy.
Right. We are moving from the sheer overwhelming number of young people to looking at what their daily reality actually is, specifically where they are going every day.
Or, more accurately, where they are not going.
Exactly. Looking at the vertical bar chart in the data, the raw numbers of kids who are completely excluded from the primary school system, it's not just a steady climb, it's an avalanche.
The absolute numbers are terrifying.
Over the decades, the absolute number of out-of-school primary-aged children breaches the 5.23 million mark. The chart actually has a big, bold arrow pointing up at that 5.23 million column, explicitly stating that the basic education system's carrying capacity is severely insufficient.
And this connects directly back to our demographic treadmill. We have to be very careful not to misinterpret this data.
How so?
This massive exclusion rate is not caused by a lack of desire for education. Families in the DRC value education immensely. They know it is the only way out of poverty.
So it's not a cultural resistance to schooling?
No, absolutely not. What we are seeing here is a profound structural capacity failure of the state.
Here's where it gets really interesting, or rather heartbreaking, when you try to wrap your head around the scale. Over 5.2 million children.
It's hard to visualize.
It is. I mean, that is the entire population of a major global city like Sydney, Australia, or the entire country of Norway. Just kids sitting outside, not in a classroom.
When a state's population is growing as rapidly as the DRC's, just maintaining the current, inadequate rate of education requires building hundreds of new schools, printing millions of new textbooks, and training thousands of new teachers every single year.
Which they just don't have the capital for.
Exactly. The physical and financial infrastructure simply cannot absorb the tidal wave of youth. The system is fundamentally overwhelmed.
But even if we magically built enough schools for those 5 million kids tomorrow, the data shows they'd still struggle. And this is the part of the data that I found the most alarming.
The learning poverty metrics.
Yes. Let's look at the children who actually do make it inside a classroom. According to the global metrics tracking the minimum proficiency level for reading, what education analysts call the GAML threshold, an astonishing 90.76% of children in the DRC fail to achieve basic reading proficiency by the end of primary school.
It's a staggering failure rate.
The data visualizes this with a donut chart, and almost the entire ring is just shaded dark gray, highlighting that 90.76%.
This raises an important question, perhaps the most important question in all of development economics. What does it actually mean if a child spends 6 years inside a building, sitting at a desk, but leaves unable to comprehend a simple, age-appropriate story?
It means we have a big problem.
It introduces the crucial distinction between schooling and learning.
I think people often conflate the two, right? We assume that if a kid is in a uniform and sitting in a room with a chalkboard, education is naturally happening.
But it's not.
No. How is it possible that 9 out of 10 kids go through the motions for years and still can't read? What is actually happening in those rooms?
It's a systemic collapse at the point of delivery. We call this phenomenon learning poverty.
Learning poverty.
Yes. Think about the conditions. You might have a classroom built for 30 students, crammed with 100 students. You have severe shortages of basic learning materials. Maybe the teacher's the only one with a textbook. You have teachers who are often undertrained, and more importantly, chronically underpaid or not paid at all for months at a time.
Which leads to massive teacher absenteeism, I'm sure.
Exactly. And crucially, you are trying to teach children who may be suffering from chronic hunger or speaking a different local dialect at home than the official language used in the school.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the compounding economic effect this has on a nation is almost incalculable.
It really is.
I mean, if 9 out of 10 children cannot read a basic instruction manual, or comprehend a simple public health warning on a medicine bottle, or do basic arithmetic to run a market stall, it creates an impenetrable, concrete ceiling on the country's economic future.
You absolutely cannot transition a nation into a modern, diversified, technology-driven economy if your workforce is locked out of basic literacy.
You are effectively trapping your population in low-yield subsistence labor forever.
And the data shows us that this trap does not apply equally, by the way.
Oh, the gender disparities.
Yes. When we dig into the secondary education completion rates, we see massive gender disparities. The system is disproportionately sidelining young women.
Which means that not only is the system failing to impart basic literacy to the vast majority, but it is also essentially cutting off half of its potential innovators, business leaders, and skilled workforce by failing to keep girls in school through the secondary level.
And this loops right back to the demographic pressure cooker we discussed earlier.
How so?
Well, demographers and economists know from decades of global data that keeping girls in secondary education is one of the single most effective interventions to lower a country's birth rate and transition out of a high dependency ratio.
Oh, that makes sense.
Right. Educated women tend to marry later, enter the formal workforce, and choose to have fewer, healthier children who they can then afford to educate.
So when a state fails to educate girls, it ensures that the demographic treadmill keeps running at a full sprint for the next generation.
Precisely. It's a devastating feedback loop.
You can't afford to educate the kids, which means the kids grow up without skills, which means they stay in poverty, which means the high birth rates continue as a sheer survival mechanism.
Which means the next generation has even more kids that the state can't afford to educate.
It's incredibly grim. And the physical, bodily toll of this poverty loop is explicitly documented in the public health data.
The public health metrics are deeply sobering.
Right, let's look at that toll. The data on child mortality is incredibly difficult to process. We are looking at a dual-axis line chart for the under-5 mortality metrics over the decades, and there is a really cruel irony in this data.
There's a big difference between rates and absolute numbers here.
Exactly. You might look at the rate of child mortality going from its historical peaks down to lower levels per 1,000 live births, and think, okay, this is a massive public health victory, things are getting better.
On paper, as a percentage, it is an improvement. But we have to look at the absolute numbers.
Right. Because the total population has exploded so dramatically over the same period, the actual number of graves being dug is staggeringly high. The baseline of tragedy is constantly expanding.
The data points out the sheer volume.
Yeah, the chart actually draws a horizontal dashed line at the 300,000 mark. We are talking about hundreds of thousands of children still dying annually, with the data hitting figures like 346,000 deaths in certain time frames.
Even as the percentage drops, the massive baseline population leads to a constant state of emergency in absolute terms.
It is a stark reminder that percentages mask human realities.
And for the children who do survive these incredibly vulnerable early years, the data points to another, more insidious crisis: morbidity.
Nice stunting data.
Specifically, yes. The data highlights that over 40% of children in the DRC suffer from stunting, with modeled estimates frequently hovering between 43% and 48%, depending on the specific year and region.
Now, I think a lot of people hear the word stunting and they assume it just means a child is a little shorter than average for their age.
Right, they think of physical height.
But in a public health context, it means something far more severe, right?
Yes, height is just the outward physical manifestation of what is happening internally. Stunting is fundamentally an invisible crisis of cognitive development.
Cognitive development, so it affects the brain.
Exactly. It occurs when a child lacks essential nutrients, proteins, and a disease-free environment during the first 1,000 days of life.
Which is roughly from conception to their second birthday.
Right. Severe malnutrition during that critical 1,000-day window permanently wires the brain differently.
Wow.
It limits the formation of neural connections. It impairs memory, attention span, and problem-solving abilities. It acts as a hidden biological barrier to the nation's human capital.
Think back to our discussion about the 90% learning poverty rate.
Exactly, it connects perfectly.
Even if you somehow fix the schools tomorrow, if you build a beautiful classroom for all 5 million of those excluded kids and put a highly trained, well-paid teacher in every room, a child who has suffered severe stunting will still struggle to learn.
Their cognitive architecture was biologically compromised before they even learned to walk.
That is incredibly sobering. You have a population fighting cognitive delays from malnutrition, facing severe educational deficits, and wait, I want to pull in the environmental data here too, because it compounds this even further.
The air quality metrics.
Yeah. The data tracks PM 2.5 air pollution exposure with a horizontal bar chart. The World Health Organization sets a safe guideline value of 10 micrograms per cubic meter.
Which is marked with a vertical dashed line on the chart.
Right. But the data shows the DRC's average exposure climbing from 24.5 up to over 40 micrograms over the years. The data explicitly states that 100% of the population is exposed to environments exceeding the WHO safety guidelines.
So, to summarize the human capital reality, you are born into an environment that is fundamentally damaging to your cardiovascular and respiratory health from your first breath.
Yep.
You are highly likely to suffer from nutritional deficits that permanently alter your brain's capacity to learn.
And if you make it to school age,
You have a high probability of being locked out of the classroom entirely or sitting in a room for 6 years without ever learning to read. It paints a picture of a human capital reservoir that is being constantly, systematically depleted from every conceivable angle.
I refuse to leave you, the listener, in absolute despair here. Because as we comb through this massive data set, there are anomalies. There are moments where the data completely breaks the trend, where the gravity seems to stop working.
You found a bright spot.
I actively searched for a win in these numbers, and I found a massive one in the public health intervention data.
You are referring to the anti-malaria campaign data. It is one of the most striking trajectories in the entire data set.
It really is. We are looking at a step chart for the usage rate of insecticide-treated bed nets for children under 5. For a long time, the coverage is essentially non-existent, hovering around 1%.
Basically, nobody has access to this vital protection against one of the region's deadliest diseases.
But then, the data shows an incredible, almost unbelievable leap. The chart draws a massive, bold upward arrow from that 1% baseline. It shoots up, reaching a massive 70% coverage across the demographic.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this single data point is profound.
Why is that?
Because it proves, unequivocally, that action matters. It demonstrates that even in an environment plagued by extreme macroeconomic volatility, high corruption, failing infrastructure, and profound institutional fragility, it is still possible to achieve spectacular results.
But how? I mean, if the government can't build schools and can't pave roads and can't stabilize the currency, how on earth did they manage to get millions of physical treated bed nets over sleeping infants across an entire subcontinent?
Because it was a highly targeted, externally supported, and rigorously focused vertical intervention.
Vertical intervention.
Yes, in public health, we talk about vertical versus horizontal interventions. Horizontal means trying to fix the whole system, building hospitals, training doctors, establishing national health insurance.
That sounds incredibly hard.
It is. It requires perfect governance and massive capital. Vertical means you pick one single disease, one single commodity, and you throw all your logistics at it.
I like to think of it like a laser beam versus a floodlight.
And that's a good way to look at it.
A floodlight tries to illuminate the whole room like trying to fix the entire national healthcare system at once. That diffuses your energy, and in a fragile state, the light just gets swallowed by the darkness.
Right.
But a laser beam, that's taking all the money from global donors, like the Global Fund, all the logistics of local NGOs, and pointing it at one specific measurable goal: physically deliver a net to a house.
When the global community and local actors focus intensely like that, they can actually move mountains.
It is a testament to the fact that progress is possible without perfection. You do not need a flawless, uncorrupt government to save hundreds of thousands of lives from malaria. You just need a functioning supply chain for a very specific commodity.
However, as analysts, we must also recognize the strict limitations of the laser beam approach.
Right, because a bed net saves a child from a mosquito bite tonight, but it doesn't build a road for that child to walk to school tomorrow.
No, it doesn't.
It doesn't pay the teacher waiting in the classroom. It doesn't create a job for them when they turn 18.
Exactly. Vertical interventions can keep a population alive, but they cannot build an economy. For that, you need horizontal physical infrastructure.
Which brings us perfectly to the next major theme in the data: infrastructure, and this incredibly fascinating concept of the leapfrog effect.
This is where the structural integrity of the nation is really tested.
We've talked about the macroeconomy, the demographics, and the human capital. Now let's look at the physical connective tissue of the nation.
Historically, that connective tissue has been severely lacking. The data references traditional infrastructure, like the SNCC National Railway Company. But traditional physical infrastructure like paved highway networks, national rail lines, and centralized power grids have historically failed to connect the country.
Why is that? Beyond just the economic volatility we discussed, is it just too expensive?
It is a combination of massive capital cost, governance failures, in sheer geography. I mean, the DRC is roughly the size of Western Europe.
Wow, it's that big.
Yes, it is covered in some of the densest rainforests on the planet, carved up by massive river systems. Laying down thousands of miles of physical concrete and steel through the Congo Basin is almost prohibitively expensive and logistically nightmarish, even for a well-functioning state.
And when you combine that geography with the lack of state capital and political instability,
Traditional infrastructure simply doesn't get built.
but then looking at the data, there is this massive counter-narrative that completely bypassed the need for concrete and steel.
The mobile data.
Yeah. We're looking at this exponential smoothing curve graph showing the explosion of mobile cellular subscriptions. For decades, the data is just a flat line near zero. Nobody has a phone.
Right.
And then suddenly it hits an inflection point. The chart actually has a target symbol at that exact bend in the curve. It explodes upward, reaching tens of millions of users, eventually closing in on 56 million subscriptions.
The data highlights this as a prime example of the leapfrogging effect.
Leapfrogging. Let's break down how that actually works.
Leapfrogging is one of the most exciting and dynamic concepts in development economics today. It explains how developing nations can completely bypass legacy infrastructure and move directly to modern technologies.
So skipping steps.
Yes. Think about how telecommunications developed in Europe or North America. For 100 years, if a country wanted its citizens to be able to talk to each other, they had to chop down millions of trees, plant telephone poles, and string heavy, expensive copper wire across entire continents.
It took decades and billions of dollars.
And massive state coordination to maintain those physical lines.
But the digital leapfrog says, skip the copper wire entirely.
Exactly. You do not need to lay thousands of miles of expensive cable through a dense rainforest. Instead, private telecom companies can come in, build a few strategic cellular towers, utilize satellite connections.
And suddenly you are beaming mobile internet directly from the sky into a relatively cheap device in someone's hand.
You leapfrog the entire 20th century technology phase and land squarely in the 21st century.
I want you, the listener, to imagine how profoundly this transforms everyday life for the average person. If you are a rural farmer in a remote province or a small town entrepreneur, historically you were completely isolated.
You had no connection to the broader market.
Exactly. You had no way of knowing what the fair market price for your crops was in the capital city, so middlemen could exploit you. You had no way to store your money safely because there was no physical bank building within 100 miles.
But with the leapfrog effect, you don't need to wait for the government to pave a road so you can take a 3-day bus ride to a physical bank.
You have mobile banking, like M-Pesa, right on your phone.
You can check regional market prices via a simple SMS text message. The digital leapfrog creates an alternate, invisible infrastructure in the sky, bypassing the broken roads and missing banks on the ground.
It is highly empowering and democratizes access to information and capital.
It's incredible. But, and I think I know what you were going to say here,
There are limits to the leapfrog, right?
there are absolute limits.
Yeah.
As revolutionary as mobile technology is, we must be careful not to view it as a panacea for development.
Because you can't text a physical good.
Exactly. You can transfer money instantly over a 4G network. You can download educational materials. But you cannot transfer a ton of harvested copper over a Wi-Fi signal.
Right. You cannot email a truckload of agricultural produce to a port.
Physical goods, heavy industry, and mass agriculture still require physical infrastructure. You still need trains, you still need paved roads, and you still need a stable, physical power grid to run factories.
And the fact that this traditional physical infrastructure remains so drastically underfunded and broken brings us to the ultimate climax of our data deep dive. We have to address the elephant in the room.
Yes, the black box of governance and the resource curse.
We have laid out the entire puzzle. The economic whiplash, the massive youth population, the failing schools, the staggering health crises. Now we have to look at the missing piece that explains it all.
Okay, let's unpack this ultimate paradox. We established right at the start of this deep dive that the country is sitting on vast, globally essential natural resources.
We are talking about critical minerals like cobalt and copper, vast timber reserves, unimaginable raw earth wealth.
And the macroeconomic data confirms this entirely.
Yeah, looking at this 100% stacked bar chart here, it shows the breakdown of economic drivers, and the reliance on natural resource rents is absolute.
It dominates the GDP.
The chart actually uses a large bracket to group all the resource rents together, explicitly labeling the DRC as a typical resource-dependent economy, highlighting that mineral rents dominate the nation's GDP share, sometimes exceeding 30%.
So what does this all mean?
Right. If there's so much raw wealth being pulled out of the ground and sold on the global market every single day, why do we have 5 million children out of school?
Why are we seeing 90% learning poverty? Why the staggering mortality rates and the lack of physical infrastructure?
It defies common sense. I want to use an analogy to explain the mechanics of what is happening here. It's like a trust fund kid who never has to work a day in their life because the checks from the family estate clear automatically every month.
Okay, I see where you're going with this.
A normal government, one without vast mineral wealth, is like someone who has to go to work. They rely on taxes, and to get taxes, they have to build a healthy, educated middle class that can start businesses and earn wages.
They have to provide services to get paid.
Exactly. But a government sitting on a massive cobalt mine is like the trust fund kid. They just wait for the royalty checks to clear from foreign mining companies. They don't need the citizens to succeed in order to generate state revenue.
That is a brilliant way to explain the economic mechanics of it. In political economy, we call this phenomenon the resource curse, or the paradox of plenty.
The paradox of plenty.
It is a highly documented, deeply tragic phenomenon, where countries with an abundance of non-renewable natural resources, like oil or minerals, actually experience stagnant economic growth, worse governance, and higher poverty than countries with fewer natural resources.
But wait, I have to push back on this. Even a highly corrupt government, a government that is acting like that trust fund kid and just collecting royalty checks, wouldn't they still want to build some roads or hospitals?
Why would they?
Just to keep the population happy and prevent a revolution, why wouldn't that massive wealth accidentally spill over into public infrastructure?
Because of the nature of extractive industries, they create what economists call an enclave economy.
An enclave economy.
Yes. To run a massive cobalt mine, a multinational corporation doesn't need a highly educated national workforce of millions. They just need a few thousand laborers, some specialized heavy machinery imported from abroad, and a single secure road or rail line connecting the mine directly to a port.
Just to get the dirt out.
Exactly, so they can ship the raw dirt out of the country.
Ah, so the wealth is generated in an isolated bubble.
Entirely. The wealth is generated almost independently of the vast majority of the population's productivity. Therefore, the government is not economically incentivized to invest the billions of dollars required to build national human capital.
The transmission mechanism that normally links national wealth to citizen prosperity is fundamentally broken.
And if we want to see exactly how broken that mechanism is, we just need to look at the governance data.
Let's do that. The global governance indicators paint a very clear, very grim picture of what happens inside this system.
The data on institutional quality is arguably the most important metric in the entire set.
Looking at this bullet graph for the worldwide governance indicators, the percentiles are staggering. For the metric of control of corruption, the country is sitting at the absolute bottom globally.
It frequently hovers between the 0 and 5 percentile mark.
0 to 5, meaning 95 to 100% of the world's nations have better institutional controls against corruption. The chart actually has a red box drawn around that tiny little bar at the bottom.
And it gets worse when we look at the metric for political stability.
Right. The data shows extreme, persistent deviation from the global norm. The line chart for political stability and absence of violence has a standard deviation band, and the valuations rest deep in the negative territory.
Constantly hovering around negative 2.0 to negative 2.3.
Out of a possible negative 2.5. There's a big downward arrow on the chart emphasizing how far below the global baseline it is.
Those numbers, the absolute lack of corruption control and the extreme political volatility, are the mechanisms of elite capture.
Elite capture.
Because the government is funded by resource rents rather than citizen taxes, whoever controls the state apparatus controls the billions of dollars flowing from the mines.
Which makes capturing the state incredibly lucrative.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Which drives perpetual political instability and conflict. The resource rents aren't being invested into schools or hospitals, they are leaking out.
They're being siphoned off by corruption, lost to massive inefficiencies, or diverted entirely to military and security spending just to manage the endless political instability.
As the conceptual logic map at the very end of our data points out, there's a huge block of resource wealth on one side and tiny social outcomes on the other. And the transmission lines between them are broken.
Marked with warning symbols for corruption and instability, deep institutional defects fundamentally limit the effective conversion of resources into human development.
Which brings us to the final, highly ironic and perhaps most tragic data point in our entire exploration today.
The foreign aid data.
Yes, we are looking at the data for Official Development Assistance, or ODA.
The data shows that the country relies on massive, continuous infusions of external aid. We are looking at a waterfall chart here detailing the donor funds, and we are talking about billions of dollars annually.
With some single-year receipts passing the $5 billion mark.
The chart puts a solid circle right around that $5 billion total, explicitly stating that macroeconomic stability is highly dependent on this external financial blood transfusion.
The profound structural irony of this cannot be overstated.
No, it really can't.
We are talking about a nation with enough raw natural wealth buried under its soil to theoretically fund its entire social and physical development 10 times over.
Yet it is instead relying on foreign blood transfusions tax dollars collected from everyday citizens in other countries just to keep its most basic social safety net from completely collapsing.
It is foreign aid that is buying the malaria nets we talked about earlier. It is foreign aid that is funding the basic health clinics and emergency food programs.
It creates a massive dependency loop.
It does. And this is perhaps the cruelest part of the resource curse. This external aid dependency loop ironically relieves the domestic institutions of the final bit of pressure they might feel to fix the broken social contract.
Wait, explain how that works. How does aid make governance worse?
Think about it mechanically. If a government fails to provide basic health care and people start dying of malaria in massive numbers, eventually the population will revolt and the government will fall.
That is the ultimate accountability mechanism.
Right. But if foreign NGOs step in and run the hospitals, supply the malaria nets, and provide the emergency food rations, they prevent the immediate collapse of the society. The state leadership can then continue to direct the billions in resource wealth toward elite capture and security without facing the immediate existential consequences of their failure to govern.
So the aid is literally subsidizing the dysfunction.
The aid is morally necessary in the short term. I mean, you cannot let children die of malaria to prove an economic point.
Of course not.
But structurally, in the long term, it unintentionally sustains the broken system. It allows the black box of the resource curse to keep operating without ever being forced to reform.
Wow. Okay. We have covered an immense amount of ground today.
We really have.
We started by looking at a macroeconomic foundation that is shaking violently, subjecting an entire population to a constant whiplash of volatility. We looked at the tremendous demographic load.
The treadmill turned up to a full sprint.
A society where half the population must carry the other half, preventing any capital accumulation. We saw the devastating realities of the human capital crisis. Over 5 million children completely locked out of the classroom.
And 90% of those who do make it inside, trapped in profound learning poverty due to systemic failures.
But we also explored the nuances. We saw the quiet, spectacular miracles of targeted interventions, like the malaria nets proving that highly focused action can save lives, even in a broken system.
We examined the digital leapfrog, showing how modern technology allows citizens to bypass missing physical infrastructure and connect to the global economy.
And finally, we opened the black box of governance to understand the mechanics of the resource curse. How immense natural wealth can actually destroy the social contract and trap a nation's destiny.
It is a breathtaking journey through the data, and it completely upends how we usually think about development.
It really does.
I want to remind everyone listening of the core philosophy behind why we do these deep dives. True knowledge is about looking past the simple, linear narratives we are often sold.
Right. Things are rarely that simple.
The data we just spent an hour unpacking proves unequivocally that a country is never simply poor or rich. It is a vast, complex, interconnected ecosystem. Wealth can be permanently trapped by structural bottlenecks.
And the only true key to unlocking a nation's destiny isn't digging more rocks out of the earth. It is converting that raw earth into human capital.
And functional, accountable governance is the only key that opens that lock.
As we wrap up, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final, lingering question to ponder long after this audio stops. Think back to the very beginning of our conversation.
About the devices we use.
Yes, we're currently living in an era defined by a massive global transition toward green energy, electric vehicles, massive battery storage, renewable tech.
The entire world is desperately clamoring for the exact minerals buried under the soil of the DRC.
The global demand is only going to skyrocket. But if a country's greatest true wealth isn't actually buried deep in the ground, but rather rests in the minds, the health, and the potential of its people, what does it mean for the future of our heavily connected, highly moralized global economy if we continue to extract trillions of dollars of physical wealth while entirely ignoring the 5 million children sitting outside the classroom doors?
It's a profound question.
The green revolution cannot be built on a foundation of human poverty. Think about that the next time you look at the battery powering your smartphone.
Exactly.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the data. We'll see you next time.